The Mayflower was not a grand ship by the standards of its own time. It was no great war vessel, no sleek merchantman built for speed. It was an ordinary cargo ship, weathered by years of travel, pressed into carrying not barrels of goods, but more than 100 souls across a vast ocean. They were men, women, and children, leaving behind familiar fields and homes, carrying with them hopes, fears, and the fragile strength to endure a journey no one could fully imagine. Life on the Mayflower was not defined by adventure as later stories would tell, but by endurance. The days were long and heavy with the scent of salt and damp wood. The nights were colder still, filled with the creak of timbers and the constant roll of waves that never allowed true rest. Families crowded into narrow quarters, sharing space meant for cargo. Privacy was rare, comfort almost unknown. And yet, in the midst of the hardship, the ship held together lives bound by determination. Strangers learning to live as one community, their fate tied to a vessel smaller than most modern buildings. To picture the Mayflower is to imagine not open decks filled with fresh air, but cramped spaces below, dim lantern light casting shadows on weary faces. It is to hear the groan of ropes, the call of sailors above, the endless crash of water against the hull. It is to smell salted meat, damp bedding, and the sharp tang of the sea, all mingling into the air of survival. And it is to feel the slow passage of time, day by day, as the ship pressed forward into uncertainty, carrying its passengers toward a world unknown. This was life aboard the Mayflower, difficult, cramped, unsteady, yet full of quiet determination. And as we take this calm journey together, we will walk the decks, descend into the crowded holds, and listen to the rhythms of a voyage that shaped not only the lives of those aboard, but the story of a continent. The moment the Mayflower left the safety of the English coast, the ship ceased to be just a vessel of wood and rope. It became a world in itself, carrying more than 100 men, women, and children across waters most had never dared to imagine. The shoreline slowly vanished, its fields and homes fading into a gray horizon, and with that vanishing came a silence heavy with realization. The passengers knew, as they pressed against the railings or huddled in the dim spaces below deck, that everything familiar was behind them. Ahead stretched only the vast Atlantic, unbroken, restless, and uncertain. Those first days at sea were marked by adjustment, the uneasy rhythm of living on a moving world. The Mayflower was not large. By the standards of ocean travel, it was small and stout, built to carry cargo, not families. Its decks creaked with each roll of the waves, the ropes strained against the masts, and the sails snapped sharply in the wind. Every sound was louder than on land, every movement exaggerated. The passengers learned quickly that the sea did not forgive inexperience. The floor shifted underfoot constantly, never still, and each step demanded balance. For children, this newness carried a mix of excitement and fear. For their parents, it was a reminder of the fragility of their journey. Below deck, life was cramped from the very beginning. Space meant for barrels and cargo now held families pressed together, their belongings stacked around them. The air was damp and thick, carrying the smell of seawater, salt, wood, and the preserved foods they had brought for survival. Lanterns flickered dimly, casting weak light across crowded faces. Privacy was almost impossible. A whisper carried as clearly as a shout in such confined quarters. At night, the sound of waves crashing against the hull filled the darkness, blending with the creak of timbers and the groan of ropes strained by wind. Sleep came lightly, broken often by the motion of the ship or the cry of a restless child on deck. The sailors moved with practiced ease. They called to one another in voices roughened by salt air, climbing ropes, tightening sails, steering the ship with steady hands. To the passengers, their work seemed both foreign and essential. Each knot tied, Each order shouted, carried the weight of survival. For many of the travelers, this was the first time they had seen men climb masts like ladders into the sky, their figures small against the swelling sails. The sea was the sailors' domain, but now it belonged to all, and the passengers looked upward with a mixture of awe and dependence, knowing that their safety rested in these hardened men's skill. The food in those early days was plain, already familiar from land, but stripped of freshness. Salted meat, dried fish, hard biscuits known as ship's bread, foods meant to last, not to comfort. Water was stored in barrels, carefully rationed, the taste often tinged with wood. Those who had packed cheese, dried fruit, or beans held them close, knowing that variety would soon be a memory. Eating was done quickly, often standing or sitting on rough boards, balancing food as the ship rocked beneath. There was little pleasure in meals, only the necessity of strength. Seasickness struck many in the first days. The constant motion of the ship was unlike anything most had ever known. Stomachs turned, heads spun, and the crowded spaces below deck filled with the sounds of discomfort. For some, the sickness passed as they adjusted. For others, it lingered, wearing them down with each wave. Mothers tried to soothe children. Fathers tried to hide their own weakness, but the sea spared no one. Even sailors, hardened by years of travel, sometimes staggered against the railings, their faces pale in the gray light of dawn. And yet, alongside the hardship, there was wonder. To stand on the deck at sunrise and see nothing but water stretching to the horizon was both terrifying and breathtaking. The sea glowed with colors of gold and silver, its waves rolling endlessly, reflecting the sky's vastness. At night, the stars appeared brighter than ever seen on land, scattered in uncountable numbers across the darkness. The passengers, weary and uncertain, sometimes lifted their eyes from their discomfort to gaze upward, finding in those lights a strange comfort, a reminder that even in their smallness, they were part of something vast. The first days also brought the quiet forging of community. Strangers who had boarded the ship began to learn one another's names, to share small tasks, to exchange words of encouragement. Families lent food to one another. Children huddled together for games in the cramped spaces. Older men offered advice to the younger. The hardships of sea life did not allow for isolation. Everyone's endurance was tied to the others. Slowly, in the dimness of the hold and the narrowness of the deck, a sense of shared purpose began to grow. The Mayflower groaned and rolled. The wind filled its sails. The water surged endlessly. Each day looked much like the one before. Yet in those first days at sea, the passengers learned what their journey would demand: patience, resilience, and the acceptance of discomfort as a constant companion. The shoreline of home was gone, the promise of a new world far ahead, and in between lay only the sea, vast, restless, and unrelenting. And so they settled into their new life, one day at a time, carried forward by the small ship that had become their world. If the deck of the Mayflower belonged to the sailors, with its winds, ropes, and sails stretched high into the sky, then the space below deck belonged to the passengers. And it was here that the reality of life aboard truly settled in. The hold of the ship, originally built for barrels of wine, cloth, and goods, was never meant to carry families. Yet it became a living world for more than 100 men, women, and children, pressed together in conditions so tight and dim that privacy became a memory and comfort a luxury too rare to name. The ceiling below deck was low. An adult man could not stand upright without bending, and for many, the hunched posture quickly became routine. Wooden beams stretched overhead, dark and damp, sweating with moisture from the sea. The air was heavy, thick with the mingled scents of salt water, damp wool, smoke from dim lanterns, and the human press of so many bodies. Day and night blurred into each other here. Light reached only faintly through cracks and narrow hatches. Most of the illumination came from lanterns hung along the beams, their flames small, their smoke clinging stubbornly to the stale air. Shadows gathered in corners, moving with every sway of the ship, so that faces flickered in and out of half-darkness like ghosts. Families clustered together in makeshift spaces, their possessions stacked in bundles around them. Straw was spread thinly on the planks for bedding, and blankets were hung up as thin curtains when privacy was desperately sought. Children slept pressed against their parents, sometimes sharing corners with strangers, as every inch of space mattered. For mothers, the struggle was constant: to keep children quiet, to soothe their fears during storms, to ration small pieces of dried fruit or bread as comfort when the noise of the sea became overwhelming. Babies cried often in the darkness, their thin voices swallowed by the groan of the timbers and the endless beat of waves. The sound below deck was never silent. It was a world of constant noise, though not the sharp kind heard above with wind and sails. Here it was the muffled rhythm of the ship, the deep creak of wood straining against waves, the thump of barrels shifting with each roll, the patter of feet on planks above, the drip of water seeping into corners. Added to this came the sounds of life packed too tightly: coughs, whispers, laughter forced low, the clatter of wooden bowls, the soft murmur of prayers. When storms raged, the noise became deafening, waves pounding against the hull, wood shuddering under the assault, and every cry of the passengers rising higher in fear, only to be drowned out by the roar of the sea. Illness moved quickly in such close air. The dampness bred coughs, the lack of sunlight weakened bodies, and the scarcity of fresh food left passengers vulnerable. Seasickness, for many, never fully faded, leaving them weak and pale even after weeks had passed. The smell of sickness mixed with the rest, lingering in the confined spaces. A simple fever became a threat to all, for no one could truly escape the closeness. Mothers tried to protect their children. Fathers tried to carry the burden without complaint. But the truth was clear: life below deck was not safe. And every family felt the weight of uncertainty each day. Meals offered little relief. Stored food, though essential, carried its own hardships. Hard biscuits crumbled dryly. Salted meat grew tougher and sometimes spoiled. Water turned stale in barrels. Eating was a duty, not a pleasure, done quickly while balancing bowls on knees or hands, the ship swaying with every bite. Sometimes passengers gathered in small groups, sharing what little variety they had saved: a piece of cheese, a handful of dried beans, a strip of dried fruit. These moments were precious, reminders of land and of comfort, but they could not erase the greater reality. Food was fuel, survival, nothing more. Yet, within these harsh conditions, life continued. Parents told stories to their children in hushed tones, filling the darkness with words that softened fear. Strangers became companions, united by the press of hardship, sharing blankets or small supplies when someone was in need. Young people whispered to one another in corners, their words carrying laughter even through the gloom. Families prayed together, their voices rising softly in the stale air, finding strength in the thought that this suffering had purpose, that the voyage was not endless, but leading them toward hope. Time below deck was measured less by hours and more by survival of days. Morning and evening looked the same. The only true measure came from the rhythm above, when sailors opened the hatches or when the passengers were allowed brief moments of fresh air. For much of the journey, life was confined to this dim wooden cavern, a world without sky, where children learned to play quietly with pebbles or scraps of rope, where adults endured the slow press of time by conversation or silence. In this way, days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, until the very sense of time seemed to dissolve into the endless sound of waves and wood. The crowded life below deck was not simply uncomfortable, it was transformative. Those who boarded as individuals, as separate families, learned that survival meant endurance together. Space was shared, burdens divided, sorrows carried communally. The air was heavy, the quarters dark, the hardships relentless, but within that narrow wooden hold grew bonds that no one had expected. In its own quiet, difficult way, the Mayflower was shaping not only a voyage but a community, forged in the crowded life below deck. Out on the open Atlantic, the Mayflower became a fragile speck in a world ruled entirely by the sea and the sky. The first days had carried the passengers gently away from the familiar shores of Europe, but once the land was gone and nothing remained on the horizon, the immensity of the journey became clear. Everywhere the eye turned was only water, restless, shifting, never still. By day it stretched in silver and gray, a rippling plain without edge. By night it became a black expanse broken only by the glow of stars, cold and unreachable. The ocean was not simply a backdrop to their voyage. It was their entire world, and it soon revealed its power in ways few had expected. At first, the calm stretches of water gave an illusion of safety. The ship rolled gently, sails filled with steady wind, ropes hummed softly, and for brief moments it almost seemed as though life aboard could find a rhythm. But the Atlantic in autumn and winter was never merciful for long. Storms rose without warning, carried across the vast distances by winds that gathered strength unseen. Clouds darkened the sky, heavy and low, swallowing light. The air grew colder, sharp with salt spray carried high by waves. And then the wind struck, sudden, furious, tearing at sails, pushing against the masts, making every beam of the ship groan as though alive with pain. Below deck, passengers felt the change before they saw it. The steady rocking of the ship became violent, throwing them against the walls, making every step dangerous. Lanterns swung wildly, their small flames bending sideways, shadows leaping across faces in frantic shapes. Barrels shifted with deep thuds, ropes creaked, and the timbers moaned under the weight of each wave crashing against the hull. The air filled with fear as much as with sound, for the passengers knew that wood and rope alone stood between them and the endless water pressing in on every side. The noise of the storm was overwhelming. Waves struck the sides of the Mayflower like fists, booming so loudly that even the loudest cries of children or the shouted prayers of adults were drowned out. Above, the sailors shouted to one another, their voices faint under the roar of wind. Orders were carried, sails reefed, ropes hauled tight. Boots pounded against the deck, water poured down through hatches and cracks, soaking the planks below. Every sound reminded the passengers that they were small, that the sea was vast, that survival was never guaranteed. Fear became a constant companion. Mothers clutched their children, holding them close as the ship lurched violently. Fathers tried to steady their families, though their own faces betrayed the same dread. Children cried out in confusion, not fully understanding why the walls and floor seemed to tilt beneath them, why water seeped in through the seams, why the air itself seemed to shake. Some passengers whispered prayers through chattering teeth, their words tumbling over one another in the darkness. Others sat silent, eyes closed, gripping whatever wood or rope they could reach, waiting for the violence to pass. The sea during these storms seemed alive, a force both magnificent and terrifying. Waves rose higher than the masts, walls of water curling and crashing with relentless rhythm. The ship climbed them like a toy and then plunged down the other side, the impact jarring every joint of wood, every bone in the passengers' bodies. Spray lashed against faces, salt stung eyes. The cold penetrated every layer of clothing. For those who dared to peer through cracks or hatches, the sight was unforgettable, a world of gray and white, water towering and collapsing, foam whipping through the air. The ship swallowed by forces far greater than itself, and yet, through it all, the Mayflower endured. Its timbers creaked but did not break, its sails tore but did not collapse entirely. Its crew fought with skill born of necessity. Passengers felt every movement, but above them the sailors worked ceaselessly, tying knots with numb fingers, bailing water, shouting commands into the wind. Their figures moved like shadows in the storm, climbing masts that swayed dangerously, pulling ropes that cut into their hands, bracing themselves against waves that swept across the deck. To the passengers below, these sounds and movements were lifelines, proof that someone, at least, understood how to face the sea's fury when storms finally passed. They left the ship battered but still afloat. The air cleared slowly, the clouds parted, and the endless blue returned above and below. Passengers emerged cautiously into the open air, blinking against sudden sunlight, faces pale from days of darkness. The deck smelled of wet wood and salt, ropes heavy with moisture, sails patched and frayed. But the calm that followed a storm was always strange, almost too quiet, as though the sea itself was resting after its anger. The survivors stood silently, listening to the gentler slap of water against the hull, feeling the ship breathe more easily as the wind softened. Relief mingled with exhaustion. The endless ocean, even in calm weather, carried its own weight. Day after day, the horizon never changed. No land, no sign of safety, only water stretching in every direction. The monotony tested spirits as much as the storms tested bodies. Time blurred into sameness, each sunrise and sunset marking another day survived but not yet completed. Some passengers found solace in small routines, mending clothing, tending children, whispering stories to pass the hours. Others stared outward for long stretches, eyes fixed on the line where sea met sky, as if searching for something to break the vastness day night. When the sky was clear, the stars offered both comfort and reminder. They glittered with impossible brightness, thousands of lights across the heavens, steady and calm above the restless sea. For some, they gave hope, a reassurance that there was order beyond the chaos of storms. For others, they deepened the feeling of smallness, of being lost in a world too vast to comprehend. The ship itself seemed insignificant beneath such a sky, a fragile wooden shell carrying fragile lives through infinite space. The storms and the endless ocean together shaped the passengers of the Mayflower. They stripped away illusions of comfort, teaching endurance in ways no land-bound life ever had. They reminded each person that survival was a gift, not a guarantee, and that the journey demanded more patience and strength than anyone had imagined. But in those moments, in the roar of waves, in the silence after, in the unchanging horizon, the passengers also discovered a resilience they had not known they possessed. The sea was merciless, but it also carried them forward, day after day, closer to a shore they had never seen. And so, the voyage continued, marked by fear and wonder alike. The storms roared and faded, the ocean stretched endlessly, and the Mayflower pressed on, its small community of weary souls bound together not only by hope, but by the shared memory of survival against the restless power of the sea. Life aboard the Mayflower was not measured in hours or minutes the way it might be on land, but in the slow repetition of tasks, the rhythms of the sea, and the constant effort to endure one more day. When the shoreline of England disappeared and nothing remained but water, the passengers and crew alike began to settle into routines that were less about comfort and more about survival. The days blurred into one another, the sameness broken only by the changes in weather, the cries of sailors above, or the sudden fear of a storm. For those aboard, daily life became a test of patience, endurance, and the ability to find meaning in the smallest of tasks. Each morning began not with the gentle warmth of sunrise, but with the ship's own noise, the creak of timbers, the slap of waves against the hull, the call of sailors adjusting sails in the early light, Passengers stirred from restless sleep, rising stiffly from straw bedding that was always damp with sea air. The narrow hold was crowded, and movement meant disturbing others. Mothers tried to keep children quiet. Fathers gathered what little food could be distributed, and older passengers stretched cramped limbs, their bones aching from the hard planks beneath them. Light was scarce. Only thin rays of sun slipped through cracks, mixing with the flicker of lanterns. The first task of the day was often food, though the meals carried little joy. Hard biscuits, so dry they needed to be soaked in water to be swallowed, formed the base of many mornings. Salted fish or meat, dense and briny, provided protein but little comfort. Sometimes a family shared dried fruit, saved carefully as a treat for children, but these moments were rare. Water was rationed, ladled out from barrels that grew more stale with each passing week. To drink it was a necessity, not a pleasure. Some passengers brought beer or weak ale, which kept longer and was safer than water, though the taste grew sour with time. Eating was less a ritual of enjoyment than an act of endurance, taken quickly before duties or seasickness pulled appetite away again. After meals, the routines of survival continued. The ship itself demanded constant care. Passengers who were able sometimes joined the sailors in simple tasks, bailing water that seeped into the hold, cleaning refuse, or shifting supplies so that barrels and crates did not tumble with the motion of the waves. These tasks were not glamorous, but they were vital. A single loose barrel could crush a child, a pool of standing water could rot wood, a corner left unclean could invite sickness. In this way, survival was as much about vigilance as it was about strength. For mothers, daily life revolved around children. Keeping them occupied in such confined spaces was no small task. Toys were scarce, so pebbles, scraps of rope, or simple carved wood became prized possessions. Songs were sung quietly to pass the time. Stories were whispered to distract from the monotony, and games were invented within the narrow limits of the ship. Yet there was no hiding the discomfort. Children grew restless, their cries echoing in the dark hold, their small bodies struggling against seasickness and the lack of fresh air. Parents soothed as best they could, though their own weariness pressed heavily on them. Clothing was another daily concern. Salt air soaked everything, leaving fabrics stiff and damp. Passengers wore the same garments for days, sometimes weeks, with little chance to wash them properly. When the weather allowed, clothes were hung out on the deck to dry, flapping in the wind, though sudden storms could undo the effort in moments. The constant dampness bred sores and discomfort, and families worked tirelessly to keep bedding aired and bodies clean with limited water. Hygiene was a struggle against the environment itself, fought one day at a time. Illness demanded its own grim routines. Coughs spread quickly in the close air, and fevers were met with herbs, prayers, and hope rather than medicine. Caregivers tended to the sick in corners of the hold, fanning them with scraps of cloth, pressing damp rags to hot foreheads, offering sips of water. Each day without worsening symptoms felt like a small victory. Each day of recovery was celebrated quietly, for in such conditions, survival was fragile and never guaranteed. Children and adults alike found moments of escape in looking outward. When hatches were opened or when the weather allowed brief time on deck, passengers drank in the fresh air as though it were life itself. Faces lifted to the sky, eyes stretched across the endless water, and lungs filled with wind that cut through the staleness of the hold. Some whispered prayers, some simply closed their eyes and savored the relief. These moments did not last long. Space on deck was limited, and the crew needed freedom to work, but they were cherished. Marking the difference between despair and endurance, the sailors' routines continued above, and though passengers rarely joined them, their work defined the rhythm of each day. Calls echoed across the deck as sails were trimmed, ropes pulled taut, and the ship's course adjusted. To passengers below, the sailors seemed almost like another world. Men at home on the swaying planks, moving with practiced confidence, their lives bound not by cramped spaces, but by open sky and constant labor. Yet their efforts were vital to all, and the sound of their boots overhead was both a reminder of distance and a reassurance of safety. Evenings came not with quiet comfort, but with dim light and the repetition of the same tasks. Families gathered close, sharing the last of their daily rations. Lanterns burned low, shadows lengthened across weary faces. Stories were told, not for entertainment alone, but as a way of keeping spirits alive. Tales of home, of ancestors, of imagined futures. These words, carried softly in the darkness, became as important as food, offering strength where bodies were weak. Then came sleep, shallow and broken, as the ship creaked and rolled, carrying its passengers into another day of the same struggle. The routines aboard the Mayflower were not designed for comfort, but for endurance. Each act, eating, cleaning, caring, waiting, was a step toward survival. Each day passed was another victory against the odds of the sea. And though the monotony was heavy, though the hardships were many, these small, repeated tasks wove together the fragile fabric of hope that kept the passengers moving forward. The Mayflower was not only a ship, it was a community bound by routine, carrying its people through each long day, one breath, one meal, one whispered prayer at a time. The Mayflower sailed not only across an ocean of water, but across an ocean of uncertainty. For the passengers, every creak of the ship, every groan of its timbers, every rush of waves against the hull carried both the promise of movement and the whisper of fear. They had left behind a world they knew, with its fields, roads, and homes, and now they moved steadily into the unknown. The horizon was always there, a thin line where sea met sky, but it never revealed anything new. Each day it seemed the same, unbroken, unchanging, a reminder that their destination was still hidden beyond sight. Fear was never absent on the Mayflower. It sat with the passengers in the crowded darkness below deck. It pressed against them when storms raged, and it followed them even in calmer days when the ocean stretched endlessly and silently. The ship was small compared to the sea, and all aboard understood this. Every wave that struck, every gust of wind that howled through the rigging, reminded them of their vulnerability. A plank giving way, a sail tearing at the wrong moment, a leak in the hull. These were not distant worries, but constant possibilities. The passengers had no choice but to live with such thoughts, day after day, hoping the sea would carry them forward rather than swallow them whole. And yet, alongside fear, there was something else, faith. Not faith only in the unseen land they hoped to reach, but faith in survival itself. Faith in the ship, creaking but steady, carrying them across waters most had never imagined. Faith in the sailors, hardened men who seemed at home in storms, whose rough voices and sure hands turned chaos into endurance. Faith in each other, strangers bound together by need, learning to lean on one another in the hardest moments. And faith, too, in something beyond themselves, something larger than the sea, larger than the ship, something that gave meaning to suffering and hope to exhaustion. Night was when fear and faith were felt most strongly. Above, the sky spread out in a way few had ever seen before. On land, buildings, hills, and trees broke the view. At sea, there was nothing to block it. The stars stretched in every direction, thousands upon thousands, sharp and cold in the clear darkness. Passengers looked upward from the deck, or through narrow hatches from below, and felt both small and comforted. The endlessness of the sea mirrored the endlessness of the sky, and in between they drifted, fragile, uncertain, but not alone. For many, those stars became companions, silent lights that reminded them that even if they were lost in vastness, there was still order, still direction, still something steady in the universe, days blurred into one another, and with them grew the strange rhythm of fear and hope. Some mornings began with seasickness, the body's reminder that the ocean would not be ignored. Other mornings began with the sharp cries of sailors adjusting sails, their voices carrying into the hold as passengers stirred from restless sleep. Each day brought the same food, the same damp air, the same cramped spaces. Yet within that sameness, each day also brought survival. Every dawn seen was a small victory. Every sunset endured was another step forward. Fear was heavy, but faith was persistent. Children felt the fear differently. To them, the sea was strange and frightening, but they also found moments of wonder in its constant movement, its colors shifting with sky and weather. They asked questions in the darkness, their voices small. When would land appear? Why did the ship rock so much? Why did the water never end? Parents answered as best they could, their words carrying reassurance even when their own hearts were heavy with uncertainty. And in those whispered conversations, fear softened, reshaped into a kind of patience, a waiting for something promised but unseen. The horizon itself became a symbol of both fear and faith. Always present, always out of reach, it seemed to mock their progress. No matter how far they sailed, the horizon remained the same, distant, empty, unchanging. Yet it also represented the hope that beyond its line, something waited, a shore, a forest, a river, a new beginning. Each morning, passengers looked toward it with weary eyes, searching for the faintest outline of land. Each evening, they watched it fade into shadow, reminding themselves that perhaps tomorrow would bring something different. The horizon was both enemy and friend, both despair and promise, shaping their days more than any calendar ever could. Fear also came from the silence of the sea. Storms were terrifying, but their violence at least gave the sense of life, of energy. Calms could be worse. When the wind died and the ship drifted slowly, its sails hanging loose, the days grew unbearably long. The ocean lay flat and still, the air heavy and unmoving. Heat built under the deck, stifling and oppressive, while above, the sky offered no relief. In such moments, passengers feared not destruction, but stagnation, the fear that they would simply drift forever, trapped between an empty sea and an unreachable horizon. These were the days when faith mattered most, when the mind had to cling to hope even as the body sagged with weariness. The community aboard the Mayflower drew strength from shared endurance. Strangers leaned on one another. Families helped those weaker. Sailors shared their knowledge, and in turn the passengers offered what support they could. Fear was heavy, but when carried together, it became bearable. Faith, too, was strongest when shared. Small groups gathered in the dim hold, speaking softly, reminding one another that every journey was hard before it was complete. Stories were told of other voyages, of hardships endured and overcome, of lands reached at last. These words passed from lip to ear, weaving a thread of comfort through the darkness. In the end, fear and faith walked side by side on the Mayflower. Neither ever disappeared, and perhaps neither could. The fear was real, of storms, of sickness, of loss. But faith was just as real, in the ship, in each other, in the promise of land unseen but believed in. The two were not opposites, but companions, shaping each day, balancing one another in the fragile lives aboard. It was this balance that carried the passengers forward, across waters that seemed endless, toward a horizon that remained hidden but not forgotten. And so, life aboard the Mayflower continued. Fear whispered in the crash of waves, in the darkness below deck, in the silence of endless water. Faith whispered in the stars above, in the voices of companions, in the steady forward movement of the ship. Together they created the rhythm of the voyage, the rhythm of survival, the rhythm of lives caught between what had been left behind and what had not yet appeared. As the weeks stretched on, The Mayflower became less a ship of hope and more a vessel of weary survival. Time moved differently at sea. Days blurred into one another, marked not by the ringing of bells or the changes of season on land, but by the restless breathing of the ocean and the steady creak of the ship. In the hold, where passengers spent most of their hours, light came dimly and air grew stale, carrying with it the dampness of the sea and the exhaustion of too many bodies pressed too closely together. With this closeness came sickness, and sickness spread like a shadow no one could escape. Illness aboard the Mayflower was not a sudden disaster, but a slow, creeping weight. Coughs began first, carried easily through the still air of the crowded hold. Children coughed into blankets. Mothers wiped their foreheads with damp rags. Fathers tried to ignore their own weakness. What began as small discomfort soon deepened into fevers, into chills, into aching bodies that could not rise from straw bedding. In the darkness, the sound of hacking breaths and restless moans became constant companions, joining the groan of the timbers and the ceaseless crash of waves. The sick lay close to the healthy, and in such confined space, the difference between them faded quickly. There was little that could be done. Remedies from home, herbs, dried roots, bits of honey, scraps of cloth soaked in water, were precious but limited. Care was given with love, but also with desperation, as families tried to shield one another from what could not be stopped. Water was offered, though it tasted stale. Bread was softened for the weak, though it was hard and dry. A gentle hand on a forehead, a whispered word in the darkness, became the only medicine many could rely on. The air below deck grew heavy with the scent of sickness, a sharp reminder of fragility. Loss was inevitable. Death at sea was not unfamiliar to sailors, but for families who had never left the security of land, it was a grief sharper than any storm. A body weakened, a fever grew too strong, and then the silence came. There was no ground to dig, no quiet place to lay loved ones to rest. The ocean itself became the grave, vast and unyielding. When death struck, the ship slowed, voices hushed, and the community gathered in heavy silence. Wrapped in cloth, carried to the deck, the lost were lowered into the water, the sea claiming them with a final splash that echoed louder than the waves. Families wept, children clung to parents, and then the ship moved forward once more, carrying life and loss together. The memory of each burial lingered in the air long after the ceremony ended. Passengers returned to their cramped spaces, but silence held them for hours. Every creak of wood, every crash of waves, seemed to remind them that the same fate might come to anyone aboard. Death was not a stranger at sea. It was a companion, walking quietly among them, unseen but never absent. And yet, even in grief, there was endurance. Families pressed on, children still cried, food was still shared, and the ship continued forward. The weight of loss settled deep, but it did not stop life from moving. Time itself became a burden. Weeks felt longer than months, and months felt endless. With no land in sight, no change in horizon, the days became indistinguishable. Morning and evening merged into sameness, broken only by storms or sickness. The endless ocean pressed on the mind as much as on the body. Some passengers lost track of the count entirely, unsure whether it had been 6 weeks or 10, whether their journey was nearly done or only just beginning. The weight of time bore down heavily, making every cough, every groan, every whispered prayer seem suspended in an eternity of waiting. Children, restless and weary, sometimes asked when land would appear. Their voices carried both innocence and longing, the kind of questions parents answered softly, but without certainty. Soon, they would say, though they did not know. One day, they whispered, though the horizon still stretched empty and unchanging. These words were not lies, but acts of hope, small fragments of faith spoken aloud in the midst of exhaustion. In such conditions, Hope itself became as necessary as food, as water, as air. Without it, the weight of illness and time might have crushed them entirely. And yet, amidst suffering, life endured. Even the sick sometimes recovered, their strength returning slowly in the darkness. A child once fevered rose weakly but smiling, bringing joy to tired parents. A man coughing heavily one week was able to work the next, his body hardened by struggle. Survival came not in triumph, but in persistence, in the simple act of continuing. Every day survived was victory. Every meal eaten despite sickness was defiance against despair. The sea itself seemed indifferent. It carried the ship forward whether passengers lived or died, whether days passed quickly or stretched unbearably. Its waves rose and fell, its winds shifted, its horizon remained steady. The Mayflower, groaning and weathered, pressed on with its cargo of weary souls, a floating world suspended between hope and fear. For those aboard, illness, loss, and the endless passage of time became part of their story, shaping not only their voyage, but their very sense of what it meant to live. And so, in the dim spaces below deck, families clung to one another, whispering comfort, offering what little strength they had. Above deck, the sailors worked, steady and unbroken, guiding the ship through waters that had no mercy and no memory. Between them, in the fragile wood that carried them all, the passengers of the Mayflower endured sickness, endured grief, endured the heavy weight of endless time. And though many were lost, those who remained pressed forward, carried not only by wind and wave, but by the quiet resilience that grows only in hardship. The Mayflower was not a palace, nor even a ship designed for human comfort. It was a cargo vessel, narrow and cramped, filled with creaking timbers, damp planks, and the heavy smell of salt, tar, and smoke. Yet in this unlikely setting, a strange and enduring truth revealed itself. Even in the harshest conditions, people reach for one another. The long weeks of the voyage did not scatter the passengers into isolation, but drew them closer, weaving bonds that would outlast the endless sea. From the earliest days, survival made cooperation essential. Families who boarded the ship as strangers soon discovered that their lives were bound together. One family's shortage of food might be eased by another's generosity. A child restless and crying in the darkness might be soothed by a neighbor's lullaby when the mother was too weary to sing. Tools were shared, scraps of cloth passed around, knowledge exchanged in whispers. These acts were not large or dramatic, but they were the steady thread of connection, binding people together in ways they had never expected when they first stepped aboard. Daily hardships were easier to bear when shared. A man who slipped on the wet deck was quickly lifted by others. A woman too weak from seasickness to care for her children found neighbors who stepped in to help. Even in the dim light below deck, laughter sometimes broke through the gloom, carried on the voices of those who chose to share stories or jokes to lighten the weight of the air. These moments of shared humanity created pockets of warmth in the cold reality of the voyage, reminders that no one truly endured alone. Meals became communal occasions, even if the food was simple and sparse. Families gathered close, their bowls filled with the same hard bread, the same salted fish, the same bitter water. Yet the act of eating together gave comfort. Small tokens of kindness, a piece of dried fruit offered to a neighbor's child, a crust of bread split in two, carried meaning far beyond their size. In these moments, bonds deepened, not out of luxury, but out of necessity, for generosity was the only wealth the passengers could afford to share. Children were at the center of much of this unity. Their presence reminded everyone of innocence, of the need to endure not only for the present, but for the future. They played with scraps of rope, stones, or carved bits of wood, and their laughter, though rare, echoed across the hold like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Adults softened at the sight of them, their tired faces lifting into faint smiles. When a child fell ill, it was not only the parents who worried, but the entire group. When a child recovered, the relief was shared by all. In this way, the children became symbols of hope, the small but living reason for the community to hold together. Work, too, was shared beyond the boundaries of family. Though the sailors bore the brunt of the labor on deck, passengers lent what help they could below. Water had to be baled constantly to keep the hold dry. Supplies had to be shifted and secured. Bedding needed to be arranged and cleaned. Stronger men carried loads for the weaker. Women tended not only their own families, but also the sick of others, and the elderly contributed wisdom, reminding the younger that endurance required patience as much as strength. These daily acts of shared labor built quiet respect, turning strangers into companions. Companions into something closer to family. Illness and loss, which had already marked the voyage, also deepened the bonds of community. A death in one family was not only their sorrow, it was a shadow that fell across all. Funerals at sea drew every passenger to the deck, their faces pale and solemn as the body was lowered into the waves. Words were spoken, prayers murmured, tears shed, and then silence settled heavily until the ship moved on. These ceremonies were brief, but they carried a sense of unity, a reminder that grief belonged to all, that the ship carried not just bodies but hearts, connected by the same fragile journey. Evenings below deck became times of gathering. Lanterns glowed faintly, shadows stretched along the beams, and passengers drew closer together, speaking softly to pass the endless hours. Stories of home were shared, of green fields, stone cottages, village markets, forests filled with birdsong. For those listening, these tales painted pictures brighter than the lantern light, reminders of what had been left behind and what might be found again in the future. Others spoke of hopes for the land ahead, forests to build homes from, rivers to drink from, soil to plant in. Though no one knew what awaited them, the simple act of speaking these hopes aloud wove them together more tightly. At times, disputes rose, as they must when so many people lived in such closeness. Voices sometimes sharpened over space, over food, over children's noise. But even these tensions revealed the bonds being formed, for quarrels were followed by reconciliation, apologies offered, compromises made. The passengers knew too well that division was dangerous. Survival depended on unity, and so disagreements, though inevitable, rarely lingered. The weight of the sea pressed them together, teaching them that harmony was as necessary as water and bread. Above deck, the sailors remained a world apart, yet even they became part of the fragile community. Though rough in voice and hardened in manner, they sometimes shared food or advice, showing passengers how to brace themselves against storms, or helping children climb briefly into the open air for relief. In turn, passengers offered gratitude, quiet words of thanks, or simply the respect of recognizing their labor. The bond between crew and passengers was not of equals, but it was nonetheless a bond, created by the shared risk of a dangerous voyage. Over time, these threads of connection grew into something larger. The Mayflower, though small, became a floating village, its people bound not by walls or roads, but by necessity and endurance. Each act of kindness, each moment of shared laughter, each burden carried for another built a web of trust. The ship was fragile, the sea unforgiving, but the bonds among its passengers made it something more than wood and rope. It became a vessel of community, a place where survival was not only about enduring storms, but about holding together in the long stillness between them. The bonds formed aboard the Mayflower would not vanish when land was finally reached. They were shaped by hardship, sealed by grief, strengthened by hope. In the darkness of the hold, in the roar of storms, in the endless waiting for a horizon that never changed, these bonds became the true cargo of the voyage, invisible, yet more precious than any goods the ship had ever carried before. For weeks that felt like months, for months that felt like years, the Mayflower had been nothing more than a world of wood and water. Its passengers had grown used to sameness. The endless horizon that offered no change, the creak of the same timbers, the taste of the same food, the weight of the same fears. The ocean had become everything, their prison, their path, their challenge. And then, on a morning that at first seemed no different from the rest, the cry went up, a cry that broke the rhythm of the voyage, that cut through the heaviness of time itself. A sailor, his eyes fixed on the horizon, shouted what everyone longed to hear. Land at first, few believed it. The horizon had played tricks before, waves rising and falling in shapes that seemed like distant shores. Hope had been raised and dashed too many times. But this morning, as the light grew stronger, shadows appeared on the edge of sight. Not clouds, not foam, but something darker, something steadier, something unmoving. Passengers pressed to the railings, children lifted by their parents, weary eyes straining for proof. And there it was, a faint line of coastline, etched against the pale sky, solid and real. The reaction was not one of sudden cheer alone, but of deep release. Tears filled eyes unashamed. Laughter broke out even among the sick, and voices rose together in disbelief that the endless sea had finally given way to earth. Mothers hugged children tightly. Fathers lifted their faces to the wind as though they could already feel the land's breath upon it. Some fell silent, unable to speak, their relief too heavy for words. After all the storms, the sickness, the burials, the weeks of unbroken ocean, there was finally something beyond the horizon. The ship itself seemed to share the moment. Sails, worn and patched, caught the wind with renewed life. The groan of timbers, constant companions of hardship, now sounded almost like music. The sailors moved with a different energy, their voices carrying less weariness and more purpose. The Mayflower had endured, and now its journey neared its end. Above deck, passengers clustered in groups, their faces turned eastward, each heart beating with the same mixture of joy, disbelief, and quiet fear. For though land meant relief, it also meant the unknown. What lay beyond that line on the horizon? Forests, rivers, fields, or hardships even greater than those endured at sea? The passengers did not know. But for now, none of that mattered. What mattered was that the sea, which had held them in its grasp for so long, was finally loosening its hold. The promise of stability, of ground beneath their feet, was close enough to taste as the coastline grew clearer. Details began to appear. Dark stretches of forest lined the shore, their shapes shifting with the morning light. Hills rose faintly in the distance, steady and solid compared to the restless motion of the ocean. Birds flew overhead, their cries strange and sharp after weeks of hearing only the wind and the waves. The air itself carried a new scent, faint but undeniable, the smell of earth, of pine, of soil long hidden from weary lungs. Passengers inhaled deeply, savoring the difference, the reminder that the world was larger than the sea. Children pointed eagerly, their voices high with excitement. There, there, they cried, tugging at their parents' sleeves, their eyes wide. For them, the sight of land was more than relief. It was adventure, the promise of running on solid ground, of feeling grass beneath their feet, of breathing freely under trees instead of in cramped holds. Parents smiled faintly, their tired faces softening, their burdens lifting if only for a moment. For the children's joy carried them all, reminding even the weary that this moment was worth every hardship endured that I in the hold. Even those too weak to climb above deck felt the change. Words spread quickly, whispered from family to family, until every soul aboard knew land was near. The sick stirred, their eyes brightening despite their frailty. For some, the thought of setting foot on shore again gave strength enough to rise. if only for a glimpse. For others, it brought tears, a bittersweet relief that they had endured long enough to see what once seemed impossible. The hours that followed were filled with waiting. Yet this waiting was different from all that had come before. The horizon no longer taunted them with emptiness. It welcomed them with promise. The coastline grew sharper, darker, fuller with each passing moment. The sound of waves changed as the sea shallowed, breaking differently against unseen shores. The very air grew steadier, carrying scents that reminded them of home, yet spoke of newness. As night fell, the land remained visible in the distance, a dark outline against the stars. Lanterns glowed softly aboard the ship, but few slept. Passengers whispered to one another, voices trembling with excitement and relief. Dreams were filled with images of trees, of rivers, of cabins built with their own hands. Some prayed softly in the darkness, words of gratitude spoken not just for survival, but for the gift of sighting land at last. The first sight of land was more than a geographical moment. It was an emotional rebirth. It reminded the weary passengers that hardship, no matter how heavy, was not endless. That beyond storms lay calm, beyond sickness lay recovery, beyond endless ocean lay shore. The relief that filled the Mayflower that day was not loud or fleeting. It was deep, quiet, and enduring, settling into hearts like warmth after cold, like light after long night. And so the ship sailed forward, the coastline drawing nearer with every hour. The journey was not finished, and challenges still lay ahead, but the breath of relief that spread through the Mayflower was undeniable. For the first time in months, the horizon had changed, and with it, the lives of those aboard had changed as well. They were no longer adrift in an endless ocean. They were travelers arriving at a new beginning. When at last the Mayflower dropped anchor and the small boats were lowered into the restless water, the long journey across the Atlantic reached its moment of transformation. The passengers, worn thin by storms, sickness, hunger, and endless waiting, could finally see the shore not only as a line in the distance, but as a place they could touch. The land stood before them, dark forests rising from the edge of the sea, its outlines crisp and steady against the morning sky. For weeks and months, they had lived in a world of water and wood, but now Earth itself waited. The long-held dream of stepping onto solid ground was about to become reality. The small boats rocked violently as passengers climbed down, their feet unsteady after so long on a moving deck. The sea, unwilling to release them easily, slapped against the sides, spraying cold water into tired faces. Children clung to their parents, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. The sailors rowed hard, their oars dipping rhythmically into the waves, pushing forward with practiced strength. Each pull brought them closer to the unknown shore. The sound of wood against water echoed steadily, mingling with the distant cry of birds circling above the trees. For many, the approach stirred emotions too heavy to contain. Some wept openly, their tears falling as quietly as the waves lapping against the boat. Others sat in silence, unable to speak, their hands gripping the sides as though afraid the moment might vanish. A few whispered prayers, voices trembling, offering thanks for survival, for the gift of reaching land after so much suffering. The weight of all they had endured seemed to lift with each stroke of the oars, replaced by a fragile but growing sense of hope when the boats reached the shallows. The passengers felt the shift of the current beneath them. The sound of waves changed, softer now, breaking against sand and stone instead of endless depths. Sailors leapt into the water first, pulling the boats closer, their boots sinking into wet sand. And then came the moment, the first passenger stepping onto shore. The earth was firm beneath weary feet, uneven and rough, but steady in a way no ship could ever be. One by one, they followed, splashing through shallow water, stumbling onto land that had never known their names. The sensation was overwhelming. After months of constant motion, the stillness of the earth felt strange. Legs trembled and used to balance without the sway of the sea. Some knelt immediately, pressing hands into the soil, lifting it to their faces, breathing in its scent as though it were a treasure. Others stood still, gazing upward at the towering trees, at the sky framed differently than it had been on the open ocean. Children laughed in delight, running short distances before collapsing into the sand, their small hands scooping earth as though it were gold. The forest loomed ahead, thick and dark, filled with mystery. Its silence was different from the silence of the sea. Where the ocean had roared and whispered without end, the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting, watching. The cries of unseen birds pierced the air, sharp and wild. The wind moved through branches with a sound unlike sails, a rustling music that filled the ears with strangeness. For those who had lived so long surrounded only by water, this new world felt vast, alive, and unknowable. Yet the relief of standing on shore was undeniable. Weary bodies felt lighter, hearts beat faster, and eyes shone with the brightness of hope. Families gathered together, embracing one another in the open air, no longer confined by low ceilings and crowded beams. They breathed deeply, filling their lungs with air touched by pine and soil, not the heavy dampness of the ship. The smallest comforts, the firmness of ground, the scent of earth, the sound of birds, became extraordinary, reminders that survival had led them here. Still, alongside relief, there was caution. The land was beautiful, but it was also unknown. No houses stood waiting, no fields lay prepared, no roads stretched into the distance. What awaited them beyond the tree line was mystery, perhaps hardship greater than any they had known at sea. But for the moment, the passengers did not dwell on that. They stood together, gazing at the horizon behind them and the forests ahead, aware that they had crossed one world and arrived in another. The Mayflower still lay anchored in the bay, a reminder of what they had endured, but their feet were now on new ground. And the world felt changed as the sun rose higher. Its light spilled across the beach, turning the sand golden, catching on the edges of waves, glinting through the branches of the forest. The passengers watched in silence, the warmth on their faces a promise that life could begin again. The hardships of the voyage were not erased, but they were transformed, becoming part of the story that had carried them here. Each step on shore was heavy with memory, with sorrow for those lost, with relief for those who remained, and with hope for the future yet unwritten. And so, on that shore, the bonds of months at sea became the foundation for something new. The Mayflower's passengers had left behind the world they knew, endured storms, sickness, and despair, and now they stood at the edge of a continent unknown to them. The earth was solid beneath their feet, the air alive with scents and sounds of a new land. For the first time in endless weeks, the horizon had changed, and with it, the lives of those who had survived the crossing. Stepping onto new shores, they carried not only their possessions but their memories, their losses, their hopes, and the quiet determination to endure once more. The first steps onto the shore were not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new and uncharted life. The Mayflower's passengers, weary and hollowed by the months of confinement at sea, had long dreamed of solid earth, of fresh air that carried not the dampness of salt and wood but the sense of soil, pine, and grass. Now that they stood upon it, the reality of their situation began to unfold. They were not returning to familiar fields or villages. They were stepping into a land that was vast, silent, and unknown. The relief of arrival mingled with the awareness that survival had only entered its next stage. The shore itself felt both welcoming and daunting. The sand was firm beneath their boots, and the forest ahead seemed alive with possibility. The cries of birds pierced the air, sharper and stranger than the gulls that had followed them across the sea. The trees loomed, tall and endless, their shadows stretching long across the ground. Some passengers knelt to touch the earth, scooping it into their hands, lifting it to their faces as though it were sacred. Others stood in silence, gazing into the distance with a mix of wonder and unease. For the first time in months, the ground no longer shifted beneath them, yet the immensity of what awaited seemed almost heavier than the sea itself. Small groups gathered along the shore, speaking in hushed voices. Families drew close, clutching children to their sides, sharing quiet words of comfort and determination. Leaders among them spoke softly of shelter, of food, of what must be done before nightfall. The ship had brought them here, but it could not provide what they now needed most: safety on land. Winter winds pressed cold fingers against their faces, reminding them that time was not a gift but a demand. A new world stretched before them, but it would not welcome them without effort. The Mayflower still rested in the waters nearby, its masts rising against the pale sky, its hull dark and worn. For the passengers, it was both a symbol of endurance and a reminder of hardship. It had carried them through storms, through sickness, through despair, yet it was no home. It had been a prison as much as a vessel, and few wished to remain within its walls longer than necessary. And so, though they returned to it for supplies, their eyes turned always toward the land, toward the forests that promised wood for building, toward the rivers that promised water to drink, toward the soil that promised a future yet unseen. The first shelters were simple, little more than temporary coverings of branches, cloth, and earth. The passengers huddled close, children wrapped in blankets, parents whispering promises that warmth would come. Fires were built carefully, the crackle of flames a sound of comfort against the vast silence of the forest. Smoke rose upward, mingling with the cold air, carrying with it both relief and determination. The food was sparse, drawn from the ship's dwindling stores, but the taste of it by firelight seemed different now, touched by the presence of solid ground. The strangeness of the land pressed on their senses in every way. The forest was thick and unbroken, its shadows deep and mysterious. The calls of unseen animals carried through the night, unfamiliar and unsettling. The stars above, though the same as those that had guided them across the ocean, seemed sharper now, framed by branches instead of sails. Every sound, every scent, every sight was both new and uncertain, a reminder that this land belonged to itself, not to them, and that it would demand respect if they hoped to endure. Yet alongside the unease grew a quiet strength. The bonds forged at sea did not dissolve on shore. They deepened. Families shared tasks. Men and women worked side by side. Children carried wood or fetched water, everyone doing what they could. There was no luxury of idleness, no time for division. The hardships of the voyage had taught them that survival came not from strength alone, but from unity, from carrying one another's burdens, from weaving lives together into something stronger than any single person. On the shore of a continent unknown to them, that truth became their anchor. The memory of those lost at sea also walked with them into the new land. Each step on soil carried the weight of absence, the reminder of loved ones buried not in earth, but in water. Their names lingered in whispers, in prayers, in the silent pauses that sometimes fell over the group as they worked. The grief did not fade, but it shaped their determination, for to endure now was to honor those who could not. The new beginning was not only for themselves, but for the memory of every soul the sea had claimed. Days slowly began to take shape. The rising sun brought labor. The setting sun brought rest. Fires burned steadily. Shelters grew sturdier. Plans for planting and building took root. The land was still strange, still filled with challenges they could not yet imagine, but it was land, solid and real beneath their feet. The passengers of the Mayflower, once strangers crowded into the darkness of a hold, now became something else entirely, a community standing together in a place that demanded both humility and courage. And so, the story of the Mayflower did not end with the sight of land, nor even with the first steps upon it. It continued in the slow building of homes, in the careful planting of fields, in the quiet endurance of long winters, and the cautious joy of spring. It continued in the hearts of those who remembered the endless sea and the fragile ship that had carried them. It continued in the knowledge that they had crossed not only an ocean, but a threshold, leaving behind the old and stepping into the unshaped future. The Mayflower had been a vessel of survival, but the land was a vessel of hope. On its shores, weary passengers became settlers. On its soil, strangers became neighbors, neighbors became families, and families became a people. The sea had tested them, but the land would define them. And in that transformation, from voyage to settlement, from suffering to endurance, from despair to hope, the story of the Mayflower found its true meaning. The Mayflower no longer rocks on the waves, no longer groans under the weight of storms, no longer carries the muffled coughs of the sick or the restless steps of tired children. Its voyage across the Atlantic is long finished, but the memory of it remains, not only in history, but in the echoes it leaves within us, for those who lived through it. The journey was not about grand adventure, but about endurance. It was about families pressed together in the darkness of the hold, about mothers whispering comfort to children who cried in the night, about fathers lifting their eyes to the stars and wondering if land would ever appear. It was about the creak of wood, the taste of salted bread, the endless sound of water against the hull. It was about fear that never fully left, and about hope that never fully died. And then, at last, it was about relief, the sight of land after months of emptiness, the feel of earth beneath unsteady feet, the breath of fresh air that smelled of soil and pine instead of salt and smoke. That moment was not an ending, but a beginning. On those shores, weary passengers became settlers, and in their quiet endurance, they planted seeds of something that would grow far beyond themselves. Now, as we close our journey with them, let the memory of the Mayflower settle like calm water. Picture the ship resting silently at anchor, its sails furled, its work complete. Picture the passengers stepping into the forest, their backs straightened by hope, their hearts heavy but steady. Picture the ocean behind them, vast and unchanging, holding their hardships but also their triumph. And as you let that image rest in your mind, let yourself rest too. The sea is calm now. The journey is over. The Mayflower has carried its people, and it has carried you. Through storms and silence, through fear and faith, to the steady shore of quiet reflection. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the long voyage fade into stillness. The ocean has fallen silent. The land is firm beneath your feet. You are safe. You are home.